Hi, I'm Austin, and this is my presentation on the goal and all of the topics that are discussed on the goal, at least the relevant topics for our class and how they apply to real world applications. Um, so on that topic, the the goal was a very interesting book. I actually really enjoyed this book. Honestly, more than I was expecting to enjoy it. It did a great job of explaining its topics through a way that was a lot more interesting and engaging, and a way that naturally brought up the topics and concerns that were then solved through the principles that were taught. Um, it was a very interesting way of doing it. I've read books that have tried this in the past, and I think this book did it better than any of the other books that I've read. Um, but in general, the principles that the book was trying to teach are the theory of constraints, focusing and identifying and addressing bottlenecks, which is through the theory of constraints. Then it discusses key metrics, specifically throughput, inventory, and operational expenses. Um, and it teaches us what is wrong and breaks down the older definitions and understandings of these metrics and what is really important. And it encourages continuous improvement, and then it also teaches managerial principles. Um, so, those are the principles that the book talks about. I want to take a minute to talk about the story of the book. And the book follows a gentleman that is running a factory, and the factory is really struggling. It's not making any money, and he gets hit with a 3 month deadline to turn the factory around, or the factory is getting shut down. He's obviously very concerned and understandably concerned about this issue, and the that ultimatum and deadline brings his thoughts back to an experience he had with his old physics professor. Um, I believe it was physics, but his old professor that gave him some strange advice and had an interesting conversation with him at an airport that they ran into each other at. And that professor and that conversation deals with the factors of these books, because the professor made a guess on the robots in the factory not being as efficient as the main character expected. And so this main character hunts him down, and it starts this journey of learning what the theory of constraints is, and applying these principles slowly but surely through the book. And it teaches us those principles. Um, and how they realize what the bottlenecks are, and how they fix those things, and how his professor teaches them about throughput and inventory, and what they actually mean um, for the company. And the book's called The Goal, and to spoil it, the goal of the book that we learn is to make money. A company's goal or a factory's goal is to make money. That is their purpose for being. It's not to improve metrics or be more efficient. It is to make money. Everything else is a means to the end, and the end is to make money. Um, and it also discusses how the managerial goals and all of these different things. But the first thing that it brings to our attention is that the goal is to make money. Now, I'm going to walk through some of the things that this book talks about, and then we'll discuss how they relate to that goal, and how they relate to the book, and how the book introduced it to us. The first topic that I wanted to talk about here was the theory of constraints. And this is what the whole book basically revolves around, and it teaches us principles constantly through the process of the main character learning how to do this, how to identify a system's constraints, and how to get over that issue, and solve this problem to make the factory efficient and profitable again. Um, we are led to the first step of the theory of constraints by the main character discussing it with his old professor, and trying to figure out what's going on. And the professor teaches us about the importance of finding bottlenecks, and why bottlenecks are so important to an ecosystem. Um, In this case, they had two bottlenecks, and the first of which I'm going to talk about mostly was a machine that produced 80% that produced a part, that worked on a part. That part took up 80% of what that factory shipped out. So 80% of the items that factory shipped out used this component that only this machine could complete. And so what that means is, and what we learn that means is, when that machine is down, that means 80% of the factory isn't making money. It is not limited to that one step in the process. Because it is a bottleneck, if that is down, it affects the entire system. It doesn't just affect that step. And so learning that importance, the team tries to find all these bottlenecks, and they do. They find the machine, and then they also find another bottleneck, which is the heat treatment portion of the process. And they then need to figure out how to solve this problem. So they discuss with the physics professor, and they learn how to exploit the constraints. And the professor helps them identify ways that they can start making the bottleneck more efficient and start working for them. One of the ways that they discovered was to stop the lunch break from interrupting the machine running. They changed how the lunch system works so that the machine was running as much as it possibly could, so that it isn't losing a cent of production time. Because for every hour that it wasn't running, it was a massive amount of money that they were wasting, because it was 80% of the entire factory that was not making money. And then they similarly did the same for the heat treatment portion of the company. And so we learned the importance of exploiting constraints and some methods that you can use to figure out how to exploit the constraint and make that bottleneck work for you. Then as they continue, they learn how to subordinate everything else to help to the above decision, to assist in exploiting the constraints. And there are several things that they do to do this that further exploit the constraint. They add in a green and red tag system, which later we find wasn't actually very helpful. It hurt them more than it helped them later down. But in the beginning, it was very useful for pushing those parts through to the machine while spending less time focused on parts that aren't going to that machine, so parts that weren't bottlenecks. Later, they learned that they made their own bottlenecks that weren't true bottlenecks through this method, but that's not important for this step. They learned ways to angle every other area and every other process to their bottleneck to make as much money as possible, make it as efficient as possible. Later on in the book, they learn a more efficient way of doing this, of ensuring the things that are being shipped out and the process after these bottlenecks are not producing more than the bottleneck can produce. You want to get it as close to what the bottleneck can produce as possible so that you're flowing through. It's a natural process. And similarly, they learned to introduce raw materials at the same rate that things were flowing through, so that you weren't bunching up and getting too much of materials in one area and not enough in other areas. They learned to subordinate everything else to match that constraint, to optimize it. And then they elevated their constraints. Right? They took those constraints and they found ways of increasing the throughput of that bottleneck, increasing the capacity. In this example in the book, they found some more older equipment that was not quite as efficient, but it was more equipment that they could make these parts on. While it took more people and it took more machines, they could effectively do more work on this bottlenecked part because they weren't limited to one machine. I don't think it was doubled, but they heavily increased the amount that they could push through of this part, thus elevating the constraint even more, making the factory more efficient, more effective at making money, because this bottleneck is widening, and they're making the bottleneck work for them. And then the fifth step is to repeat the process. Reanalyze, re-identify constraints in the systems, see what you can do better, see what you can change, and this is really the heart and soul of the goal. It was the theory of constraints and how to improve a system using the theory of constraints and focusing on those bottlenecks. Now, for throughput, inventory, and operational expense, this is a really key component. It might have been better to talk about this before the theory of constraints, but the book discusses these metrics and why they're so important, and kind of changes the definition around from what was understood when the book was set, which was quite a while ago. But it talks about how throughput is not just what you can produce in a day. It's not what part you can produce over here and what part you can produce over there, and what you can put together at final assembly. It is the rate at which a system generates money through sales, right? The goal is money, and so throughput needs to reflect that goal. It doesn't matter how much of one part is going through in that one area until you're trying to identify bottlenecks. What you're really concerned about is what you are converting, the rate at which you're converting your work and the materials you have into money. Then it goes on, and I mentioned work, so operational expenses, and raw materials, so inventory, because those are the next two items. And inventory is all the money that has been invested into purchasing things the system intends to sell. So all your raw materials, all the components that you need, if you're ordering from a different company, that is your inventory. And operational expenses, all the money the system spends to turn inventory into throughput. These are the metrics that you need to care about. Everybody wants throughput to go up. They want more sales. They want to convert more material and more work into an item, a product that they can sell. And they want to bring inventory down, and they want to bring operational expenses down. They want to bring those things down because anything that you have in inventory is not sold. So you want to be able to be as efficient as possible at getting inventory to come into your building and out of the building as quickly as possible. That's why inventory wants to go down. Same with operational expense. If you're spending money to turn it into that, you want to bring that cost down. And I think the book makes a good point of showing how, for instance, the suggestion of putting the heat treatment and outsourcing that. In that circumstance, they would make far more money than they would spend on heat treating, shipping out parts. And so while it looks like operational expense is going up, and it is, you're making way more money. And so it outrageously puts throughput through the roof by doing that. And so these are important metrics to pay attention to when you're using the theory of constraints and you're trying to make continuous improvement. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about for what the book discusses is managerial principles. And the book, I believe I mentioned this earlier, discusses the importance of managerial stuff quite a lot. There's a whole section where the main character asks himself, like, how do I be a good manager? And he goes through that whole journey of trying to figure that out, and he learns the principles of managing a system and managing a team. And the book discusses several of these naturally throughout the whole thing. And these are some that I noticed that I found to be important for managing managerial principles. The first is measurements drive behavior. We just talked about those metrics. It's really important for a manager to identify the metrics that are going to actually drive behavior and emphasize and make those measurements important, make those metrics important for your team and for yourself, so you're actually seeing what is going on. You're not getting focused on efficiencies. The book talks a lot about efficiencies. Oh, this area was X amount efficient, and this area was X amount efficient, and they learned that these efficiencies of the area doesn't matter at all. They need efficiency through the whole process, efficiency in making money. And in order to identify that, they needed to identify a bottleneck. That is the heart of this managerial principle. You need to know what you need to measure in order to understand how your system is working. And so do the people underneath you, so that they can influence these metrics and influence the system appropriately and understand what they're influencing and how it needs to be influenced. The second is to seek answers. This team, throughout the whole book, the main character put together a team of people at the company. It was an unofficial team, but this team sought answers constantly, and they learned how to seek answers and the importance of not just relying on what you learned in college or the tried and true methods that have been passed down for ever and ever. They sought answers. They sought out what was going on, and that was so important to them. And conveniently, you need metrics and measurements in order to obtain those answers. And they sought out answers from bizarre sources like a physics professor. And so you just need to be looking for answers everywhere. And then teamwork, they brought that team together, and it made them far more efficient. The minds working together made their goal a lot easier to obtain because they were all looking at it from their own perspective with their own skills and their own backgrounds, which is, again, a great principle of management. And they didn't give up. I think that is a lesser one, but it's important that this team, faced with this dilemma, chose to try to solve it and try to overcome it. And they used the rest of these skills in order to do so. And they worked smarter, not harder. They didn't just say, oh, we're going to do a bunch of overtime. We're going to do blah, blah, blah. We're going to just get out there and work, and we're going to hire all these people that are just going to work harder. They didn't do that. They thought through what their problems were. They identified what was going on. And when they couldn't, they brought somebody in that could identify and assist them. They worked smarter instead of working harder to accomplish their goals more effectively and in a more long-term sense. And then lastly, it was to improve the system and not the parts. That the whole thing about bottlenecks is just so important. Improving a part of the system is not the same thing as improving the system. Unless you are identifying the bottleneck and you are working to make the whole system more efficient, you might as well not be doing it. It's not affecting anything, and it can even hurt things if you're just willy-nilly changing how your process is. It needs to be guided, and it needs to be for the purpose of improving the efficiency of the entire system. Again, that efficiency is the efficiency of making money. So these are the principles that were taught in the book. Now, I found a couple examples of how the theory of constraints and just continuous improvement is applied in the real world and has affected the real world. The first is in retail. It admittedly is kind of light, but Walmart optimized its stock leveling and improved efficiency through the use of IT and technology to be able to be more efficient at how it reintroduces stock into the system, so it's not holding on to a bunch of stock in some areas and completely out of stock in other areas. It used these tools and it importantly identified a constraint in its system, which was mismanagement and fluctuating levels of inventory. They took that constraint and they found solutions, technology in this instance, to reduce the randomization and balance the system so that they're not having mountains of inventory or worse, running out of inventory when it came to making the final sale. So that's a great example of how a retail store used the theory of constraints. And honestly, the theory of constraints from the readings that I've done is common everywhere, to Amazon, to all these other companies. I talk about Mazda down here and a healthcare place. It is just very common because it is a great way of identifying where your system can grow and improve. The second one I found was in healthcare, the Owensboro Health Automated Inventory and Saving, which saved time and reduced waste. Same principle as what Walmart did. They identified that inventory was wasting time. It was an inefficient bottleneck. While it might not have been the most pressing constraint, it was a constraint that could be solved through automation, and they did see more time being put towards things that were bringing actual value instead of just keeping an inventory, because it was an automated system now. So it effectively pushed forward the goal of making money. They were able to see more people, they were able to treat more people, and they were able to then earn more money from the services that they were providing without wasting time at inventory management. The last example from the lips of I believe it was the CEO of Mazda, it might have been the owner, where Mazda used the theory of constraints to cut the development time in half. They were facing these hybrids and they were struggling to compete, and they needed to cut their development time for a more efficient engine in half, or just reduce it in order to remain competitive. And I believe it was in 2007 that the owner talked about at a later date, they applied the theory of constraints to improve their development time of these better engines. And because of that, it saved their company. They were able to accomplish their goals in a time frame that was able to keep them making money and keep them profitable, using the theory of constraints. And that is really the important part there. The last thing I wanted to talk about is a modern example, or actually a case study of timber harvesting, and specifically of timber harvesting using the theory of constraints. And this is a case study where they reviewed old data and explored the value of using the theory of constraints in this. And they proved that it would be valuable to use the theory of constraints in a logging operation. They also showed that nobody's really doing that in this industry, but they were able to find clear constraints. In this case, it was the chainsaw man, the person actually cutting the trees down. That job is extremely slow, much slower than the other areas. And they were able to balance that constraint with the other responsibilities of the other equipment and the other jobs. And they were able to schedule better things like maintenance for the other machines. And the focus was getting as much work out of the chainsaw men every single day that's possible. And by doing this, they were able to increase the efficiency and take off a couple days from the actual time that it took to complete this whole job. They proved that the theory of constraints would be really useful in this industry because it's a very common constraint in the industry, but that you need to be looking for the theory of constraints and adjusting for them before you even start, and actively as you go through the process, instead of what they did here, which is a retrospective on those things. So it ended a little bit hazy because nobody in the industry is really doing it. Perhaps since then that has changed, and especially if it is making them more efficient and getting the product out faster, I think the theory of constraints would be extremely useful here, as did the people doing the study. But it was just interesting to see the theory of constraints laid out in an actual scientific journal, discussing how it can actually be used to make that industry more efficient. And lastly, I just wanted to bring it all together. Again, I really enjoyed the book. It was a very fascinating look at the theory of constraints and just the Socratic method for figuring out what is wrong in a system and finding that area that needs to be improved and continually going through that process. and just discovering what the constraints of a system is, and how to actually manipulate those constraints and solve those problems. And it can be applied on larger scales than what was shown. And at the end of the book implies that when he's going into be the leader of the division, and he has to figure out how to manage this whole system, and they're lost, and they realize that the theory of constraints applies to any system, and that you don't have to focus in on one bottleneck, but really the constraint of even the factory was the processes that were in place that led to the problem. The bottleneck turned out to not be a bottleneck once they shifted their processes and changed how they did business. And what that shows us is the constraint is how we approach processes, and what we're doing now. And we need to turn a lens onto the processes that we are actively participating in any system. The bottleneck was just the symptom of the process, and it helped the main character and his team trace back the steps of where they went wrong and correct those processes. And it was just so fascinating seeing it compared to philosophy and the scientific method, and really just the method of discovery, right? Finding out what the world means, and you just narrow your scope into a system that is meant for making money, and then you discover, you theorize, and you look honestly at what's going on in order to answer questions and understand the system better, and from there then you can make changes to the system, and you can make informed decisions and make informed changes. Anyways, I really enjoyed the book, and it taught me a lot more than I was expecting about the theory of constraints. Um, yeah, and I enjoyed it.